Gracias a quienes está grabando en este momento la conversación. Muchas gracias por atender este encuentro.
Recorded. Thank you for attending this event and for attending the previous events.
Y por favor, tendrían que estar en el canal, en el Zoom, cuando está abajo la figura del mundo, tendrían que, si lo quieren escuchar en inglés, picar la opción de inglés, y si queremos escuchar a nuestra traductora, tendríamos que...
want to listen to him directly or use the Spanish option for...
Bien. Es para mí un honor presentar al profesor Clay Spinuzzi de la Universidad de Texas.
It's an honor to present Clay Spinuzzi, a professor of the University of Texas. I am grateful that he stopped his demanding activities to give us time. He's an authority about reading and writing. Thank you for everybody that has visited us during this conference. Professor Spinuzzi should come back again when we don't have these strict circumstances restraining us. Like I said, he's a professor of rhetoric in the University of Texas. He has done research in methods and methodology of research. And that's why we have him in the conference today, and activities in information. He wrote 3 books, Tracing Genres Through Organizations, MIT Press 2003, Network, Cambridge University Press 2008, Topside via Amazon Create Space 2013, and All Edge University of Chicago Press 2015. Spinuzzi teaches graduate courses in the Department of English and the School of Information, as well as the Human Dimensions of Organizations MA program. He has helped us for 3 years in institutional research with consistent ideas in investigations about the world, and the things that happen with reading and writing in those environments. And with the University of Monterrey in Mexico and 3 Colombian universities, we are doing some research about practices and internships of students in the places of work. And those publications have been very enriching for us during this research. Our interpreter is Monique Gomez. She's Colombian. She has been in the United States for more than a decade. She is an interpreter in various sectors, especially in the judicial area. She's certified as a judicial interpreter in the state of Pennsylvania with 7 years of experience in the courts in Pennsylvania. Thank you very much, Professor Spinuzzi. Welcome. Welcome everybody to this conversation. We are gonna post the questions in the group chat, and the interpreter will read the questions to him at the end.
Well, thank you. Thank you, everybody, for coming to here to hear me speak. And thank you so much for
inviting me. Escucharme, y muchas gracias por invitarme. Estoy emocionado de hablar con ustedes el día de hoy.
Last 25 years, I've been conducting field studies in workplaces to understand how people communicate, coordinate, and collaborate at work, primarily using writing technologies. In studying workplaces, I had hoped to better understand the relationships among writing, work, and information and communication technologies, or ICTs. Today, I'll be talking about 4 changes in labor over the 20th and 21st centuries, 4 changes that are related to writing and information technologies. I hope that by understanding them, we can better understand this moment in history and how we can respond to it, both in our research and our teaching. And first, we'll talk about some of these changes in a broad sweep. Because the world is growing more literate, Writing is perhaps our most useful and flexible tool. It makes its way into nearly every aspect of our lives, saturating our lives to a degree that it has never done before. For instance, for 98% of human history, we didn't have writing. We finally invented it in 3200 BC as a hacked together accounting system for elites. But now nearly universal literacy means that the overwhelming majority of elementary school students learn a basic level of reading, writing, and textual problem solving. This is a big deal. In my country, the United States, in 1870, 20% of people at or above the age of 14 were illiterate. They were unable to read or write in any language. By
incapaces de leer o escribir en cualquier idioma.
Up to only 0.6%. In 1870 in the US, the degree ratio for high school was only 2%. Only 2 out of every 100 students graduated from high school. In 1970, the degree ratio was 77%. By 2015, it was 83%. And we see these trends globally as well. From 1987 to 2016, we saw an increase in
También vemos estas tendencias a nivel global de 1987 al 2000.
in the Middle East, 28% in South Asia. When the majority of the population are literate, literacy becomes a very important part of our toolkit for solving problems. When we face a problem, we often reach for a textual solution. And that increase in literacy is paired with other changes in how we work. Let's just look at these statistics from the United States. In 1800, over 40% of US jobs were agricultural. In 1870, about—
Professor, could you speak a little slower?
Oh,
having
sure.
trouble keeping up.
Yes. In 1870, about
En 1870,
were manufacturing jobs. Now both of those classes of work are trending downward, and we see a spike in knowledge-based and creative work and routine, low-wage service work. Agriculture
trabajo de baja profesionalización.
Point that they are remarkably productive without a large percentage of workers. Instead, high-paying jobs are concentrated in knowledge work, work that involves analyzing and transforming knowledge. Knowledge work uses those important literacy skills even more intensely than other forms of work. And part of the reason knowledge work has spiked is that it has the infrastructure to do so. We are suffused with information and communication infrastructure wherever we go. And finally, mobility.
Y por último, la movilidad, acceso.
Phones and tablets has changed globally. For instance, when the offices in the United States closed because of COVID-19, many workers just grabbed their laptops, their iPads, and their work phones and relocated home. By 2024, there will be 8.9 billion mobile subscriptions globally, far more subscriptions than individuals. So historically speaking, this is an amazing situation. How did we get here? We have seen 4 specific changes in labor from the beginning of the 21st century to now. These 4 changes are to labor's object, its division, organization, and location. And we'll take these in order. First, the object of labor. By the object of labor, I mean the thing that labor is meant to achieve or transform. For instance, crudely speaking, the farmer's object of labor is her field, which she transforms from earth to crops each year. A blacksmith's object of labor is iron, transformed from raw iron to implements. But for more and more people, the object of our labor is now representations, words and numbers that represent something else. As I mentioned, when a highly literate population sees a problem, we reach for a textual solution, a representation. Those representations are also much easier to circulate now than they used to be because of the explosion of information and communication technologies in our world. For instance, it's easier and cheaper to send an email or an instant message than to print a memo and circulate it physically in an organization, as we had to do in the mid-1900s. We now have many, many primarily digital ways to cheaply and quickly share these representations and to combine them. As we saw earlier, In 1800, over 40% of the US labor force was focused on agricultural work, crops, and livestock, but now it's under 1%. Fewer than 1% of US workers feed the rest of us. By 1860, over 60% of the workforce was in manufacturing. Now it's just over 20%. The majority of the labor force is either in service work, barbers, restaurant staff, cashiers, or knowledge work, transforming and processing representations. And because we have over 99% literacy, because ICTs have expanded radically, the cost of sharing information has dropped and jobs have become more easily textualized. That means that more labor is focused on representations, progressively transformed by intersecting fields and disciplines, and thus emergent. That is, the value of these representations comes from transforming them across different areas of expertise by temporarily combining disparate specialties to create new, unique situations. For example, think of financial services, software development, graphic design, and teaching, all of which use different specialized genres to represent knowledge. To perform their work, the practitioners primarily transform these representations along with others in different specializations. And that brings me to the second change, the division of labor. Since work is increasingly textualized, increasingly about representations, these representations are often more tractable to algorithmic approaches. Thus, some work can be made generic, algorithmic, offloadable, de-skilled. It can be given to non-humans, machines, or to lower skilled humans. Other work
Los poco calificados, en otro son programables, se pueden realizar.
This table provides a quick comparison between these two types of labor. Generic labor is low skilled.
Y autoprogramable es de baja, puede ser automatizado o se puede descargar y se enfoca a hacer tareas en vez de tomar decisiones. Y estas tareas.
Its value is in being predictable and routine with low discretion in how one executes tasks. Since it's algorithmic, it is formalizable. It is considered low value because it is understood as algorithmic with low skill and discretion. And finally, it represents terminal learning. As long as the worker or machine can follow this algorithm, the worker or machine doesn't have to learn anymore. In contrast, self-programmable labor tends to be multi-skilled, carried on by specialists who can self-structure their own work to achieve the goal. They're expected to solve problems and create knowledge, and they have high discretion over how to do this. Self-programmable labor is considered unformalizable. For these reasons, it's considered high-value work, and it requires lifelong learning. Those who do self-programmable work must continue to learn. But these two types of labor are not as strictly bounded and separated as the table suggests. For example, this figure is from a study I did of search engine optimization, or SEO, in 2010. SEO specialists faced an ever-changing landscape, requiring them to constantly innovate. To deal with this constant innovation, they would develop new routines that they could either automate or outsource to interns, thus opening up time to address new challenges. That is, today's self-programmable labor becomes tomorrow's generic labor, so that the specialists can take on new, unique challenges. And we see this trend across the landscape of knowledge work. Since the mid-20th century, organizations have outsourced non-core functions as well as automating routine labor. One 21st century example is that of online labor markets such as Upwork, which outsource both macro tasks, self-programmable labor, and micro tasks, generic labor. I want to draw your attention to the paper in the lower left corner, where Laura Stepanen and colleagues examined how online labor markets interact with Nordic working life. And this brings us to the third change, the way that labor is organized. Labor has become increasingly focused on representations and increasingly self-programmable, so it has also become organized differently. Barley and Kunda term this type of labor organization post-bureaucratic, although we could use other terms such as networked or ad hocratic. Think about those organizations that have shed non-core functions over the past 50 years. The sole proprietor.
50 años. Miren las empresas unipersonales y los pequeños negocios que han sido habilitados por las TIC y la mano de obra genérica. Hay más trabajo en las burocracias.
Hierarchies and disciplines. Work is projectified, organized around a project, not a department or specialty. And thus leadership rotates through the life of the project with different specialists.
Con diferentes especialistas que lo dirigen en diferentes momentos. Cuando el proyecto termina, el conjunto se dispersa.
This change in organization means that a given specialist might be working on different projects with different teams at the same time. As Uriah Engstrom argues, labor is no longer mainly in reasonably well-bounded, although interlocking and networked structured units, and the boundaries and structures of activity systems seem to fade away. We see context collapse as a specialist might orient to several distinct projects, sometimes sharing solutions between them. Here's a diagram from a paper that David Guile and I have recently drafted. The circle at the top left represents how an initiating entity sees the project's object, the labor object. As that entity brings in other entities with different specializations, they see the object of labor differently from within their specialties. And these objects are not equal. They cohere only loosely. The more specialists are brought in, the more diverse their conceptions and enactments of the object will be. For instance, imagine a technology innovator who wants to become an entrepreneur, commercializing her technology. To make this happen, she needs to find an unsolved problem that the innovation can solve for a specific market. That means she needs to seek people with expertise in that market. In marketing, in funding, in technical aspects, she may have to pivot several times, finding different problems to solve, and continually dropping some specialists and adding others before she can find a market fit. After several cycles, with several specialists rotating in and out of the project is completed, and hopefully the object coheres enough to endure as the team of specialists disperses. Now, that doesn't mean that bureaucratic work will disappear. Post-bureaucratic work is built on the foundations of bureaucracies. You don't want a temporary heterogeneous coalition guaranteeing the quality of your water supply or your legal system or your election system. We need hierarchies, steady routines, and laws to underlie post-bureaucratic work.
Que sustenten el trabajo postburocrático. Y esto finalmente nos lleva a la ubicación del trabajo. Dado que gran parte del trabajo tiene como objetivo las representaciones y dado que las representaciones pueden circular de forma barata gracias a las tecnologías de información y comunicación, gran parte del trabajo se distribuye globalmente. Un ejemplo que vimos antes es el de los mercados laborales online. Al mismo tiempo, los resultados del trabajo tienen que ser localizados para funcionar dentro de un lugar específico. Juan Tuong Song ha escrito un gran libro.
Localization affects social media design. Another case of this tension in labor's location is that of co-working spaces, shared working environments in which independent knowledge workers, such as freelancers, gather to create knowledge and benefit from it, working alone together. Co-working spaces are quite flexible, adhering to principles of community and collaboration. Although, as my co-authors and I found, these two terms are quite underdefined. Alessandro Gassini argues strongly that co-working spaces are occupied by both precarious workers and new entrepreneurs. He says they are contradictorily coexisting with different attitudes in the same relational milieu. That is, although co-working is about community, co-workers may also be living in different realities, figuratively speaking. having trouble finding common ground on which to build solidarity. And I'll just skip this slide. So these are 4 changes. And with these changes, we also see crises. In fact, COVID-19 has thrown these 4 changes into sharp relief. Some people have been able to move their work home with them, working with representations on mobile devices, focusing on their self-programmable labor. Others have not. They're still primarily working with things rather than representations, and we are seeing the result, crises in solidarity. By solidarity, I mean the ties that bind people together in a society, the recognizable shared interests that allow us to agree on an underlying social compact. Imagine the ties that are being stretched and broken as some people are safely able to work from home, while others have to shut down their work or risk illness in order to work. Ferdinand Tönnies speaks of solidarity in terms of Gemeinschaft, which means community, ties of blood, marriage, and friendship with thick trust, and Gesellschaft, society, ties of different people living together, thin trust. Paul Adler and Charles Heckscher pick up this distinction, offering a third type of community, collaborative community, a framework for trust in dynamic and diverse relationships, reconciling greater degrees of both solidarity and autonomy. This is swift trust. A collaborative community emerges when a collectivity engages cooperative, interdependent activity towards a common object. My colleagues used this distinction, my colleagues and I used this distinction when examining co-working spaces in the late 2010s. We found that although the co-working community idealizes collaborative community, many leaned towards Gesellschaft, in which a dominant actor underwrote the co-working space, and lateral co-working relationships were based on institutional or transactional considerations. That is, co-working's month-to-month subscription model was not stable enough and placed the financial risk on the co-working site's operator. To defray that risk, co-working sites tended to integrate with other related businesses, conventional office leasing, event spaces, entrepreneur incubators, creating a more stable but institutional or transactional relationship. In co-working spaces and other arrangements optimized for post-bureaucratic work, we find that the object of labor is typically emergent and defined externally, a collaboration with others outside of the actor's specialty. That is, the top right quadrant, which is characterized by cross-specialization projects, emerging values, and swift trust. Work of this kind tends to focus on representations as objects. It is largely self-programmable. It takes advantage of post-bureaucratic work organization. It can be located anywhere. In fact, such collaborations are built on networks that cover much ground with largely empty space. In more concrete terms, someone working out of their home may have more solidarity with others who are kilometers or continents away than they do with people on their own street. You can imagine how this state of affairs attenuates the bonds we have with our neighbors. So what are the implications? In terms of understanding writing, these 4 changes to labor suggest that we sometimes must consider writing's status as a collaborative, representational practice that changes reciprocally with labor's object, division, organization, and location. The ways that we work and the ways that we write are more deeply related than ever before. In terms of studying writing, we might do well to consider it as an unfolding material practice, one that includes representations, social divisions, and organization, and increasingly cross-cultural audiences. And finally, in terms of teaching writing, we might keep reminding our students and ourselves that writing is a pragmatic opportunity or activity, not an idealist activity, or at least not just an idealist activity. Writing standards, what counts as good writing, will change under the pressure of how we actually use it. understanding writing as something that we do with each other and with technologies and for different purposes and effects in the world suggests different criteria for teaching and evaluating writing. And that is my presentation, and I'll be happy to take questions now.
I'm going to check the chat.
Monique, puse una pregunta en el chat.
Okay.
Si quieres la traducimos.
Espérate, cambio de idioma. We have found in our research in the labor world that the writing experience turns from an individual experience to a collective experience. In your experience, how does this affect the way professors teach at the university?
Okay, that is a very good question. When I had a discussion about this with a researcher named Deborah Brandt a while back. I'll put her name in the chat. Okay, Deborah Brandt, I see I misspelled her name, but that's okay. Deborah Brandt studied how individuals went into writing heavy fields, such as writing press releases or writing letters for a politician. And she found that they felt divorced from their labor. Now, this surprised me because I've watched a lot of people writing in workplaces, and they didn't seem to feel that kind of angst at all. What I realized in talking to her was that these people had majored in writing. They had an idea that writing kind of came from them, that it was part of their self-expression. The people who I was studying didn't feel that way at all. They didn't feel much ownership of their writing, and they did not consider themselves to be writers. I think as what I have taken back to the classroom from my research is that people do have to think of themselves as part of a group. They need to be able to understand their writing as doing something in the world, not projecting their own self or their own personality necessarily. And how that unfolds in my classrooms, I have people do a lot of group projects. I have people revise each other's work, and I have people test their writing on other people to see what the effect is. When I have them do these things,
ellos los pongo a hacer estas
a different way as a tool. Now, that does not mean that they don't do personal writing as well. They just understand writing as maybe a broader tool than they had understood it before.
Let's check the next question. How do you guarantee that a co-working space would not generate a gregarian mentality?
I'm sorry, a what mentality? Oh, did you say gregarian?
Yes, gregarian.
I don't think you can guarantee that. When I first started studying co-working, it was a very new phenomenon. And part of what I found was that people had very different expectations of what the site would be. Some of them saw it as a way to work alongside other people because they needed a friendly office environment. Some people found it, thought of it as a backstage, a place where they could find other people who they could subcontract to, or some place where they could pick up work from other people. And so those are two very different expectations. They imply two very different configurations from a co-working space. And what I found, at least in the early 2010s, was that that did not result in separate spaces for those different functions. So people's expectations clashed constantly. Some of them just wanted to work. Some of them wanted to drink beer at 4 in the afternoon and bring their dogs in. And some of them wanted to have meetings with clients. These were not compatible. I think that now, 11, 12 years later, we do see more specialty co-working spaces, and we see more institutional rules so that, let's say, people don't bring their dogs in except under very specific circumstances.
Okay, I'll take the next question. Mm-hmm. Okay.
O pasantes que ella identifica como las personas que sienten choques al enfrentar la escritura laboral.
What is your opinion about contextualized writing? Because students facing their professional practices feel a clash when
Yes. I used to ask my students to do
Yo solía preguntarles a mis estudiantes, pedirles que hicieran
cases that I would bring from the work world. And what I found was that did not give them enough context. More recently, I've been asking them to either do, let's say, service work, like pairing them with a nonprofit, where someone from the nonprofit will come in and talk about their context and their expectations. Or I will have them go in and investigate a specific workplace. And I find that these work much better because for the students, they're no longer just trying to please me as a teacher. They're trying to figure out a larger situation and negotiate among many stakeholders. And I think that is really what we see most in workplace writing. Workplaces have different factions. They have different locuses or loci of power, and students kind of have to figure that out. I hope that was helpful.
Estaba escribiendo una pregunta, pero te la voy a transmitir porque me demoraría más escribiéndola. Y es que en algunos de los textos del profesor Spinuzzi leí algo que me llamó la atención, y es que muchos de los problemas del choque con el mundo del trabajo que encuentran los estudiantes realmente serían muy bien resueltos si también dentro del proceso de formación se les brindaran herramientas etnográficas, es decir, mucha observación, mucha toma de nota, trabajo de campo, porque de esa manera resolverían no solamente los asuntos de la escritura, sino otro tipo de circunstancias que encuentran como novedosas en el mundo del trabajo.
Professor Spinuzzi, I find that a lot of the shock that students find in the writing, working world could be resolved by presenting the students with more tools, more ethnographic tools like observation, note-taking, physical situations, so that they could resolve better their writing in these circumstances and not have this shock in the working world.
Yes, I completely agree. I'm very excited about whenever my students get to go into a workplace and start to figure out how things work. In fact, my favorite class, which I'll be teaching next semester, I ask students to do exactly that. I teach them basics of qualitative research, and then I have them select an organization, spend some time in it, observe people, interview people, pick up texts, and use those to build a big picture of how that organization works. And when they can do that, they have a much better idea of how to write for specific purposes, and what things are important versus unimportant for that particular workplace. I think too often when students come to college, and I think this is especially true for the first 2 years, they are ready to solve well-formed problems. They expect the professor to give them a specific problem, and there should be a specific answer, and they should be able to find that answer. And when they get to, let's say, their 3rd year at university, they start to encounter harder, more ambiguous problems where there isn't a neat solution, and where the professor might not have a specific solution in mind. They will just evaluate whatever the student comes up with. That is a hard corner for our students to turn. And I think that the more that we can get them in the mindset of researching, watching, observing, so they can build a mental model of a workplace for themselves, or a writing context for themselves, I think the better off they will be.
Si tenemos más preguntas, por favor,
If anybody has any more questions, please post them on the chat. I think I'm seeing the chat. Blanca, yo.
Claro que sí. Por supuesto.
Professor Spinuzzi, I asked Blanca if I could ask a question.
Okay.
I am not in the academic world, but my son has dyslexia, and he uses a lot of tools that help him with his writing, like speech to text technology and things like that. Do you find that people with this kind of learning disabilities have a space in the writing working world today with the technologies available, or is it as hard as it used to be? And I'm gonna interpret the question before you answer.
Okay.
Un hijo con una dificultad de aprendizaje que se llama dislexia, y él usa tecnología para poder escribir, usa la función de dictado de Google, por ejemplo, donde en vez de tener que escribir puede dictar sus ensayos e informes. Mi pregunta para el profesor Spinuzzi es si las personas con este tipo de dificultades tienen más espacio en el mundo de trabajo, de escritura, por los dispositivos que están disponibles ahora, o si sigue siendo difícil?
Okay, I think it's a great question. Okay, I think I have not done research on this. I'm sorry, Monique, I can hear you, and it's really throwing me off.
No he hecho
Thank you. Okay, I have not done research on it. I can tell you anecdotally, I
pero
think
puedo
there's
decirle de manera anecdóticamente que ahora hay mucho
and other sorts of reading difficulties than there were before. I think that technologies have been very, very helpful in this. I've read anecdotes about, for instance, people changing the font on a document so that they can understand the letters a bit better. If you have dyslexia, maybe the letter appears, I don't know, backwards to you. But if you have a specific font that is asymmetrical, then it's much easier to read the document. We are finding, or I should say, I am seeing students who once would not have made it to college using these technologies to help them through and becoming wonderful students. And I think that's really critical for us. I think we need to be able to knock down as many barriers as we can so that people can perform as well as they can, and so they can do more. I see education, I mean, I'll back up. Many students in the United States see education as an individual right. They get good enough grades so they get to go to the university and they will pull themselves through. And that is really not how it's supposed to work. We have these universities so that people in different communities can send their children to us, and we can help those children become the next generation of doctors, lawyers, teachers, business owners. And the more barriers that we can knock down, the more people are going to have that opportunity to go back to their communities and make things even better. And so we have really pushed assistive technologies at the University of Texas in particular. We want to make sure that everybody has access to the technologies that they need to help them bridge the gap. And I'll say one more thing. A lot of people think of writing as something that just flows out of your soul. Writing is an incredibly tall stack of skills that we start learning just as soon as our parents read to us as babies. And we get a sense that, well, you can take a look at a page and translate it into sound. That's a hard concept to get. Writing is a technology. It's a technology that we've had for a very long time, but it's still a crucial technology. And adding more technologies to it, making it more robust so that more people can access writing, I think that's a wonderful thing.
Bien, Mónica. Hay creo que 4 preguntas más. Le diríamos que tenemos 4 preguntas más, por eso, como a ver si logramos responderle a las 4. Brevemente va
We
la
have
primera.
4 more questions. Diana Benavides.
¿Cómo se ha acompañado a los estudiantes de prácticas laborales en las carreras profesionales de los Estados Unidos? Si existe un diálogo con las universidades y ese tipo de proyectos universidad empresa.
How do you follow students in their internships in the professional careers in the United States? Do you have a dialogue with the colleges or university projects or institutions?
is a bit different from institution to institution, but the model that I've seen most frequently, the student will take the internship as a class. They will go into the workplace, and as they do, they'll keep in touch with, let's say, one professor that's paired with them. They might communicate with that professor between 2 and 6 times a semester. And at the end, they tend to write a report.
Okay, next.
En tiempos de pandemia ha sido evidente la precariedad del empleo en ámbitos profesionales, incluida esta que es nuestra labor docente, y que recientes estudios indican que, se me pierde,
during pandemic times, it's evident that there are less jobs, less professional jobs, including our area of education. Recent studies indicate that the automatization could replace the human function as a teacher, professional. Do you think this is possible?
I think that we will see some things being replaced, but I don't think work will go away. Well, okay, so I have 2 answers. Answer number 1, when we became more efficient at growing food, as I mentioned, we used to have 40% of people in the United States in agriculture. Now we have fewer than 1%. Those other people are still employed. They're just employed in other disciplines. And I think that will continue. I think people will continue to get pushed out of generic labor into self-programmable labor. So I think education will become more important. That's my first answer. The second answer in the United States is that I think we in particular are workaholics. We probably could be working fewer hours. We could probably take a month off for vacation as the Europeans do. But we are not organized that way as a society. And that is somewhat pathological. So I think that, at least in the United States, even if we automated most work, it would be a long time before we stopped giving people jobs. They would just be maybe less significant jobs.
Y vamos a hacer la última pregunta. Perdón. Sí. Dice una docente que por lo visto vamos a tener que pasar, ella es Piedad, Irma Piedad, vamos a tener que pasar de los procesos pedagógicos de enseñar a escribir individualmente a enseñar a escribir textos de manera colectiva. Según
it looks like we are going to move from teaching processes to teach by teaching individually to produce collective texts. In your teaching world, how do you handle teaching collective texts?
Okay, well, the most important thing is to teach people how to work in a group. And surprisingly, my students often don't have a very good background in this. And that is because often their professors or their high school teachers before them have told them, you're going to do a group project, a group writing assignment, get into a group of 4 and figure it out. And that is a recipe for disaster. Left to their own devices, these group projects sometimes turn into like Lord of the Flies. war of all against all. So when I ask them to do group writing, I give them principles of project management. I give them principles of how to work together as a group. I ask them to put together a charter for their group so that they agree on what their responsibilities are going to be and what to do if someone doesn't meet their responsibilities. That's number one. But number two, I get them to use collaborative writing technologies so that they are working on the same document at the same time. I tend to suggest that they use Google Docs, but if they want to use something else like a wiki or some other sort of online collaborative tool, that's absolutely fine. The important thing is for them to have a shared text where they don't feel individual responsibility for individual sections, where they can go in and work on sections together. The last thing I do is to talk to them about types of editing, because when they think of editing, they usually think of correcting spelling mistakes. And what I push them to do is start thinking about maybe a set of, or an editing round where they're just looking for spelling and punctuation, an editing round where they're checking for meaning, where they are working on making things more concise. And I start trying to get them to think of this as this document, not as an expression of their personality, but as let's say a piece of craft work that they can polish and reconfigure and change until it reaches a set of criteria that they all agree on. I think that's really the most important thing, that they have to be able to come to agreement on criteria.
Gracias, Mónica. Muchas gracias al profesor
Thank you,
Spinuzzi.
Monica. Thank you, Professor Spinuzzi. Many people are thanking you on the chat.
Thank you.
And we will keep our promise to stay connected with the research we are performing here, and hoping that you can come to Colombia whenever it's available to show you the results of our research. And we're enjoying everything that you put in your texts.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me come.
En el chat hemos compartido los enlaces para los
We have shared in the chat the next events so that you can attend the next conference, please.
Outstanding. Thank you so much.